It's wonderful to be here. Wow, what a crowd. And kol hakavod, congratulations to everyone that brought you all here, and thank you for being here. And we have all sorts of interesting guests from the community and from Israel, so it's very exciting to be here. I've been asked to talk about the elections, a little bit of an analysis and what this might mean for the future. Did I get that right? So I'll try to be a political scientist just for a minute, but before I give you a little bit of an analysis of why we're facing such an interesting process of coalition forming in Israel right now, I do want to ask you a question. Has anyone in this room heard of Dr. Ruth Calderon? Okay. 3? Okay. So let's repeat that name. Dr. Ruth Calderon is going to be a name that we're going to hear a lot about. She is a new Knesset member. She is a woman scholar. She set up 2 seminaries in Israel out of 100 that are secular theological seminaries. Secular theological seminaries where secular Israelis, religious Israelis come together either before or after the military and study not just Jewish history, Jewish traditions and culture and holy texts, but also philosophy and study about other religions, Islam, Christianity, enriching the identity of Israelis today. She gave her maiden speech at the Knesset around 2 weeks ago, and she's become a national and maybe an international phenomenon as a result. And she did something very simple at the Knesset. She got up and she gave a lesson in Talmud to the Israeli parliament. Now think about that for a moment. She is secular, she's a woman, she basically gave a political speech, and she peppered it with very rich Jewish tradition and a Gemara lesson, a Talmud lesson. And sitting behind her was the chairman of the Knesset interim from Shas, ultra-Orthodox or rigorously Orthodox rabbi, who basically introduced her, listened to what she had to say, and then entered into her speech by actually participating. This is all in the Knesset. So from the gallery, various women legislators started yelling, "We knew that he wouldn't let her finish her speech." And Dr. Calderon turned around to the galleries and then turned around to the rabbi and said, "No, he's participating. This is a conversation." So here she was, changing Israeli political culture, being a symbol of a woman teaching Talmud in the Knesset, which was a moment that most Israelis didn't even know what to do with. And it went viral, and hundreds of thousands of people have seen this video. The reason I'm telling you this story is that something is changing in Israel that is very exciting. And we have an opportunity to seize this moment to inspire our communities here to reconnect back to Israel. Israel is changing in very significant ways, and that change could also be very, very significant for you here. So the story is exciting, but I want to take a step back, look at these elections, see what it means to us and to all of us and where we're heading from here. You know, there was a narrative in the press before the elections that Israel's going down the deep end, that Israel's becoming very right-wing, that people in Israel are losing faith in democratic institutions, and lots of narrative. None of this actually happened in reality. The voter turnout rate in Israel, does anyone want to take a guess how high it was in these elections? Almost 68%, which was high in American terms. In Israeli terms, pretty good, highest over the last decade. But we used to be at 80% in Israel until the 80s, when we had a change in our system. We had a split vote between the prime minister and the Knesset. Whatever, the numbers started going down. But our turnout rate was almost at 70%. That's considered fairly high. The number of parties that ran in these elections, anyone want to take a guess? America 2, Israel 34. We had a pirate party, we had a marijuana party, we had all sorts of parties. 12 of them crossed the threshold. We have a threshold of 2%. So if your party is less than 2% of the overall vote, you're out. Now, sadly, 7% of our vote was lost because of those 34 parties, only 12 crossed the threshold, and they're now members of the Knesset. The 12 is an average number. We usually have between 10 and 15 parties. 12 is a lot, and our Knesset now is 12 parties. But the significant number is that the ruling party in Israel is, Likud and Israel Beitenu, which is actually two parties that came together. Forgive me if I'm speaking Chinese, for those of you that don't follow this as wonkishly as some of us do. But if we have a parliament of 120 seats, and the governing party is less than 40 seats, that governing party is in trouble, okay? So if you're less than a third of the seats of the parliament, it's going to be very, very difficult to rule. Now, going into our elections, the polls were that Likud and Israel Beitenu, that came together into one party, would be over 40%. And here we were in a moment where the governing party, expected to win big, would have been the big, the big powerful party. But the numbers went down to 31. So now Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is trying to form a coalition, and he only has 31 seats, of which Likud is only 20. Likud is only 20, and he has to assemble a coalition of at least 4 additional parties. Now, how do you do that in Israel when each party is pulling in a different direction? And this is part of the reason why it's so difficult to put together a government in Israel today. But deeper than that, the conversation is changing, the tone is changing. People in Israel are thirsty for new politics. The second largest party, Yesh Atid, is a party of 19 seats led by Yair Lapid. Ruth Calderon is in that party. By the way, she was number 13. The reason she was number 13 is that she never believed that he would receive more than 6 seats. So the deal was, I'll support you, put me on the list in some unrealistic position. I'll never be in the Knesset anyway. Lo and behold, she's number 13. They win 19 seats. She's in the Knesset. So her response was, oh my God, the night after the elections. So the number 2 party in Israel is 19 Knesset members, and they're all brand new. All brand new. Imagine the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, all new politicians. They've never been in Congress before. They don't know Washington. They all have to go through orientation. So our parliament of 120 has 48 new Knesset members. The numbers are actually 54 if you count those that came back from the cold. So roughly half of our parliament is new. Women in our parliament, the highest ever, 27 out of 120. The percentage is higher than the United States and Britain. It's the highest ever. In 1988, we had 7 women Knesset members, now 27, so it's up by 400%, and it's very significant. Thank you. This is just the tip of the iceberg, because behind the elections are NGOs and women power is coming to bear in Israel in many, many aspects, which should be very exciting. Now, the number one issue in Israel right now, you would think, with the Arab Spring and the Middle East falling apart and country after country going pop around Israel and weapons of mass destruction and a million different things happening around Israel with Iran and Lebanon and Syria and Egypt and Muslim Brotherhood, you'd think that these would be the big issues in these elections, but they weren't. And the big issues in Israel were about who are we, what kind of country do we want, what is the arrangement between secular and religious and the various tribes that make modern-day Israel. And the conversation is really changing in very significant ways. And I just want to give you a little bit of data so that we can talk about this knowledgeably together. The Haredi community in Israel today numbers 750,000 people, almost 1 million. Of those 750,000, roughly between 50 and 60% are under the poverty level, and 50% of the 750,000 are under the age of 14. So if you think about Israel in the future, first grade in Israel today, the average number for students is around 50% Arab and rigorously Orthodox, and 50% will go to the army in 18 years. You realize that there are things in Israel that have to change very, very significantly. And the question is, how do we make that happen in a way that the majority accommodates the minority accommodates the majority, and we actually have a conversation that makes sense? The number one issue right now is this: how do we integrate the rigorously Orthodox Haredim into the army, but also into the educational system and into the workforce? Because over the long term, this is not sustainable, and we all understand that. And different parties have, different political parties have different ways of expressing that. I think the hope is that we find a formula that works, that helps the Haredim maintain their identity, but also become more involved in the institutions and the life, the modern life of Israel in a more full way. There are some indications that this is already happening. There's an emerging middle class among the Haredim. There's a movement to get the kids to study English, math, and science, not just holy texts, and get them better prepared for the modern world. There are around 6,000 Haredim men and women now studying for high-tech and technological professions in higher education. So there's some, but not enough. So putting all of this together, politically, economically, demographically, things have to change. The conversation is going in that direction. But I do want to give you maybe one more sentence on how rich and significant this could be. When Zionism began, the idea was to create a new Jew, a Jew that would fight for himself or herself, a Jew that can build a state, and two things were in the way: the fear of the holy texts and the fear of the outside world. So Zionism became almost a shaking off of Jewish traditions. So secular Zionism, or Zionism, became the new religion. And this was the case for many, many decades. But over the last few years, and actually the last few decades, and it's emerging more and more powerfully, secular Israelis are looking for their identity. Now, we see it in music. We don't see it in fringe music. We see it in mainstream rock and roll music. Much of it is based on Jewish text. We see it in movies. Remember, Israel's Oscar candidate last year was Footnote. What was that about? It was about two biblical scholars fighting among themselves about how to study Talmud. You see it in everything. You see it in movies, you see it in TV, you see it in music. Musicians want to sell their music. That's why they're going to Judaism. Jewish life in Israel is experiencing a tremendous renaissance, and it's back to Ruth Calderon, these theological seminaries, which are really leadership seminaries that are sprouting up all over Israel, alternative synagogues, alternative ways of celebrating Shavuot or Jewish holidays, doing it in the Negev, doing all these wild things, because Israel, or people in Israel, are looking for a new spiritual identity. So secular Israel isn't becoming religious, but secular Israel is looking to be enriched through Judaism. And what this does is that it opens many doors in Israel towards Jewish brethren overseas, communities overseas. It opens doors to you to be partners in this process in Israel as Israel changes from the bottom up and from the top down. So it's a very exciting but also uncertain time, both in the region and certainly in Israel itself. What will Israel's government be, and when will this happen? I couldn't begin to tell you. I could just give you the latest from the news today. Likud is in very intensive negotiations with Beit Yehudi, which is Naftali Bennett, a neighbor of mine from Haifa, the son of parents that came from San Francisco from a Reform congregation. He's now Orthodox in Israel, and he leads the modern National Religious Party in Israel, which won 12 seats, and Yair Lapid, which won 19. Together they're 31. It's 31 versus 31, and they're now in a very extended coalition poker game that will now extend beyond the initial 30 days and into the additional 2 weeks. So Prime Minister Netanyahu will go to President Peres Saturday night after Shabbat, and he will say, I need 2 more weeks. President Peres will give him those 2 weeks. We may or may not have a government before President Obama comes to Israel on March 20th. So if all that is clear to you, I'm very happy. It's not clear to me, but I tried to do my best.